Hello and welcome back to this downplay idealistic crusade. This is my video continuing in my series on rereading the classic Hardy Boys canon and looking at both the original and revised text, this time of course for Book 7, The Secret of the Caves. So I'm talking about the 1929 original text by really the series creator Leslie McFarlane, and then comparing it to the 1964 revised text that's been in print ever since by Andrew Svensson, who went on to write a good number of the revised texts and other books in the digest era of the series. So these are both names you're going to see pop up in a lot of these videos that I do about talking about the canon. I think this is very much a similar case to what I talked about in the last video, talking about Book 6, The Shore Road Mystery. Even though the books are generally viewed as part of the example of being entirely different in terms of the level of the revision, I think both The Shore Road Mystery and Secret of the Caves, they do still technically have the same core plot idea or mystery idea at their center. Here, of course, it's dealing with the boys trying to find a missing college professor. But the reason for their disappearance and the overall denouement of where the plot goes is different. I think the key things that are the same is the fact that the boys are looking for a missing college professor, and the location they wind up looking for him particularly is a particular stretch of a deserted beach area where there are a lot of caves, so of course fits the title. So the general idea of the plot is still there, and the location is still there, and the boys essentially go camping out there. And so you can see the sort of through line, how you could technically call the revised text, you could still call it The Secret of the Caves, because there is a secret and there are caves. So it will make you think of the original text if you're more familiar with that. But like the Shore Road Mystery, the revised text of Secret of the Caves, it adds so much additional action and an additional subplot to the original story that it frequently no longer resembles the original story. But again, I think the core is still there. So I think it's very much like what happened on the Shore Road Mystery. However, with this, I think Shore Road Mystery is an exceptionally strong revised text example. I think the revised text here is very strong and has a lot of moments that you remember from reading these books, hundreds of times growing up. But I don't know if it's exactly as immediate as the sort of very action-oriented revised text of Shore Road Mystery. Here, it has a bit more of a languid pace because the core story of the original text has a more languid pace. And once again, the trade-off between the original and revised text, particularly because it's a Leslie McFarlane text, you lose out on a great deal of the humor and the charm and the interplay between the characters. And you do lose a bit of the sort of grounded reality because the story is simpler in the original text, and you have more pages because of course the greater page count of the original text before they were streamlined and cut down to the 160, 170 page average of the revised text. It gives you more breathing room, and as I've said before, the McFarlane books really feel much more like fully fleshed out novels. And that's the trade-off, because the revised texts are so much about getting to the action beats, A to B to Z, and they add so much additional material. This is a good example in terms of we have an entire additional subplot about Fenton Hardy trying to deal with a radar station being sabotaged, and this is a book written in 1964, so the additional elements of action go back to what I've said also before in previous videos. I think you can start to see the influence of 60s pop culture, particularly, most notably, in the James Bond films. And this, of course, is the year of Goldfinger. So I think that also starts to play into everybody feeling like they had to basically jazz things up with more action and more, not necessarily outlandish elements, but I think it was probably viewed a lot of the stories from the 20s and 30s were maybe a bit too simplistic, and that they needed to have the stakes raised. And there is some truth to that. Some people might feel that way, but also there is something to the original text. If they're a bit more simplistic in terms of the story is simple on the surface, it might make sense a bit more that this could be something that teenagers would find themselves involved in terms of trying to solve various mysteries and things. And there's nothing wrong with having a simpler mystery. It's just a different type of story. So I think it's interesting that I think there are a great number of parallels here with Secret of the Caves in comparison to the book that preceded it, Shore Road Mystery. And this will happen throughout the series when I'm going through and doing these comparisons, because even when you have two books like this that are, they're really, they start to tell different stories. At their core, they're the same. So I think this is one of those examples where some people might determine it as a part of the canon that the two versions are vastly different, and they are. But at their core, you could recognize the same sort of bones of the similar plot structure. And again, there's a missing college professor. But reading these back to back, you definitely get that sense of there's less of the world building in the revised text. The pace is much quicker. You don't get as invested in each individual scene, and also again a lot of the sort of character foibles and get sort of sanded off and especially in the humor. There's another thing that makes it over into the revised text that's in the original text is there is a particular character they encounter on the beach who is basically an eccentric hermit, possibly with malevolent intentions. It is unknown. But whereas that's a certain thing in the revised text, in the original text, he is much more what would be termed, not necessarily over the top, but he has much more of a character, essentially. And the drama, even in those particular sequences, is really heightened. And the books build to two completely different climaxes, of course, still around the same area. So I don't think you lose the core of the original text and the revised text. So that is a good thing, because if you're going to keep the same title and it's supposed to be, if it's supposed to be the same book, you shouldn't lose the core values and ideas of the plot and structure of the original. So I think this is one of those cases where the revised text really tries to just add on a lot of stuff to make it feel much more of a again, to give it higher stakes, to make it feel more, I guess, contemporary for 1964 audiences, even though this is still the children's book series, essentially. So again, I think there are a lot of parallels to Shore Road Mystery and how the revised text approaches things. I still think both are, great, essential, classic reads of the series, and I think each has their own strengths, and they are very much. I feel like I've broken record already, but it feels very much like each sort of represents the strengths of the original McFarlane text, and then the revised text represents the strength of what were the best positives about the revisions. However, again, there are the notable trade-offs, and they're not going to jump out to you if you read the books, especially when you were growing up like I did. You're not going to know about the revision process of the Stratemeyer Syndicate and all the things that were changed and how a lot of the books were completely gutted and some are just completely different and just carry the same title and all that stuff. But when you read them individually, this stuff doesn't jump out to you as much. It's only when you read them directly back to back where it's just like bright flashing neon signs going, this is different. And when the core of the plot is still there, I think that makes it all the more apparent. The differences in the tone. The tone is really, I think, the key to explaining the differences between the original and revised text, and especially the Leslie McFarlane text, because the McFarlane original text really are the soul of the series. Is where everything, all the precedents were set, and it's where you get the most amount of characterization and humor and world building and all those wonderful things that really make these books come to life. Another key example, I've said this before, when you read a McFarlane text, the jokes are funny. You will literally laugh out loud as you read them, and the situations are much more three-dimensional and fully realized. Whereas in the revised text, because the pace is so much increased and there's all this other stuff going on, the characterizations do take a hit, and depending on what you may prefer in terms of pacing, you might prefer one text over the other, but I don't think anybody can argue that the revised texts do suffer from the sort of mandate of the revision process, and then it's just going to be certain books fare better than others. So I do think both books are classics of the series. I think anybody should read. I mean, it's hard to not be able to recommend any of the first sort of 10 of any given series, but here it's very important. They're all sort of building blocks. But again, it's very much like the Shore Road Mystery. There are positives to each, but I don't feel the revised text of Secret of the Caves really quite maybe grabs the reader as vividly as the revised text of Shore Road Mystery, where I think that revised text really worked well with the increased pace and the additional extra layers of all the other action and subplots. Here, because the core story moves a bit slower and was already a bit more simplistic, I think that sort of carries over into the revised text, even though they added all this additional stuff with the additional subplots and upping the ante for the villains and things. So it's just not quite as immediate, essentially. So I can't really choose one over the other when doing the sort of final wrap up denouement of which do I prefer. Of course, I grew up with the revised text, so I've not read the original text as often. It is obviously much more of a newer to me experience, but it's fascinating sort of seeing all the veils lifted and seeing what the original core story was in 1929 for a book I've known and loved my whole life, because it's kind of like experiencing the story brand new, and because it's not the same. And again, it's more of an intimate story because it's much simpler. It's all about the search for this missing professor, and because there's not a whole other subplot going on, you have more time to focus on the actual characters, and with that sense of world building and humor and greater dimension to everything, it feels much more lived in. And I've said that so many times, but I can't stress how important that quality is, and that's what I think people are picking up on when they talk about the genius of McFarlane's prose, and that these are incredibly well written, because they are. It doesn't matter that they're children's books; they should be respected because they are beautifully written and still engaging after all this time. And especially even knowing the revised text by heart, I read the original text, and you can't deny how much more of an experience they are. And that's even speaking from a literary standpoint. So again, I think there are strengths to each, and it's going to be up to your own personal preferences, which you may prefer. But there is definitely an adjustment period if you're like me and you grew up with the revised text and you've read it 1,000 times, and you finally read the original text, and it's just like, the total head explode moment, because you recognize a lot of the same story beats, but it goes in a completely different path. And even for being in the 1920s, I quite frankly, frequently it goes to much darker places where, in terms of the suspense moments, things are drawn out further and get even darker. So that's another, I think, definite positive to the original text. They're not afraid to go a bit darker, and they don't have the same sort of in-house, not quite censorship, but part of the revision process was definitely toning down the danger factor of things. And of course, the revision process is always said to have been put in place to remove dated aspects and some elements of cultural stereotyping, which do creep in to the original books, because these are books from the 20s and 30s primarily. Again, nothing in almost every example, nothing is ever, a terrible or horrible thing, and it's not like it's a major part of the book. Really, only 2 books deal with some cultural stereotyping on a more major level, because those 2 books are dealing with characters in a much more major focus who are of different ethnicities, and you do have some degree of that, as you would in pretty much any form of media from that time period, and especially adventure stories and pulp stories and things like that. So it's never anything that you wouldn't encounter in reading a lot of material from the 20s and 30s. It's just unfortunately it was part of the time. Here in Secret of the Caves, there's not a whole lot of that. You might encounter a stray phrase or something here and there, but that should not keep you from reading the original text, because I think it's really a rewarding experience. But that's what the Syndicate kind of claimed was the reason why they did the revision process, but really it was to update things for what they felt were the 50s and 60s desires, but it was also to cut down the page count, which of course cut down on manufacturing cost, and they were able to streamline everything and sort of get all the books a bit more homogenized. And again, by sanding off the rough edges, they also removed a lot of the world building and the character development and the more gritty realism of the original text. So I think you get that anytime you read both versions of any of the original 38 books. So those are my thoughts on Secret of the Caves in terms of the actual texts themselves. I think they're both excellent. They're both great representations of how the original McFarlane text and the revised text, particularly for this point in the early to mid 60s, how they play out, and gives you an idea of the strengths of each if you haven't read all of them. Now, to talk about the different cover arts, as I like to do, because I think that's kind of fascinating, all the books sort of have the similar, very striking but simplistic on the surface approach of depicting the boys encountering again the eccentric hermit character who possibly has dangerous intentions on the actual beach with the caves. And it's again very simple but a nice striking image. We start as always with the W.S. Rogers cover for the original 1929 edition. And it is in the exact same style as his other covers. We have the red text with the same Hardy Boys logo. These, of course, would be the original white spine editions. Then, of course, that would be the rarest and most valuable version of the book, getting an original first edition. But as is common with his covers, it seems simple at first. Seems like, oh, this is a nice painting from the 20s, and it has some color to it, but it's very simple. But it's quite deceptive, because if you look at it closely, we have the scene depicted from the original text where the crazy old hermit guy is charging the boys with his loaded shotgun. So, yeah, it's not necessarily what you would picture for a children's book. Again, two boys being threatened by a crazy old guy on a creepy beach, coming out of a cave with his shotgun, trying to literally shoot them, apparently. So, again, it's interesting how deceptive the Rogers covers can be, because they seem kind of beatific and simple on the surface, but they always do depict an element of action, and it is a direct representation of a particular dramatic moment from the book that it's depicting. So that's of course, what any great cover should do. Now we move on to where the update was done in the sort of yellow spine era. So 1944, we have another A.O. Scott cover who did most of the sort of first revision covers. And this, like a lot of his covers, it keeps the same, it's depicting basically the same scene, but it's changed the aspect a bit. And this one's going more for suspense, because this is where the boys have actually gone into the hermit's cave to sort of investigate and see if they can find any clues to who this guy might actually be. But here we have a wonderful bit of drama, because we have the shadow of the hermit coming back, and basically the boys are being caught red-handed right before they're going to be threatened with said loaded shotgun and shot at. A much more dramatic use of color as you get in a lot of Scott's covers. The composition is really nice, and again, much more immediately dramatic. We have the title in yellow, so it fits with the sort of yellow spine era and the updated spine. But once again, as I always feel with a lot of Scott's covers, you just can't get away from the sort of more cartoony flavor of the actual art itself. The way the boys are drawn, it's it's realistic enough, but I've always felt Scott's covers, they just sort of have more of a cartoony feel, for lack of a better term. And again, that may just be my own personal preference, but it's also hard when you're so used to a particular other cover. So we jump over to 1960, where once again Rudy Nappy was tasked to develop a new cover, and this was still for the original text, which remained in print for quite some time. So this is one of the Nappy covers that sort of takes the idea of the Scott cover but gives it completely new composition, still the same scene, but much more photorealistic, and still with a really bold use of color. And to be honest, it's even more bold because there is much more. We have the open sky background, which really makes the actual colors being used besides the sky, the water, and the beach and the caves really stand out more. But it's the strength of the composition and the fact that I think it actually manages to heighten the suspense over the Scott cover, even though the Scott cover is much more immediate. Here, the eye lines of the boys and the hermit, it's almost like they're meeting, so it really gives you a greater sense of suspense, I think. But again, this was done while the original text was still in print in 1960, and then carried over to the revised text in 64, and was in print all the way up until the attempt by Penguin to do the new covers. So for me, this is the definitive Secret of the Caves cover. This is what I think of when I think of the book. This is what most of my copies have. This is what you'll find still in hardcover editions with the dust jacket, and the last versions will have the Rudy Nappy art. And again, it's just his ability to create a sense of photorealism with great fine detail. I think he was really unmatched in this particular section of literary jacket art, and I do think he is one of the great book illustrators, because of course he started primarily in the era of pulp magazines and pulp detective thrillers and pulp novels. So this lasted until 2017, when we got the Jonathan Bartlett cover for, again, the new Penguin attempt that, again, tried to do. They pretty much stopped before they reached book 10, and so all the others still have their flashlight editions. But here, I think it is one of the better of the Penguin covers. It is depicting pretty much the similar scene once again, with the new logo and this sort of stylized approach with a little bit of a cartoony flavor. But here, there's not some crazy color overlay, and I think it's probably the most realistic looking of the Penguin covers. It's very simple though, so and we still have the ominous figure, but now he's in the background, and the boys are in foreground, and it's okay. But of the four, I think it's the least dramatic, and I think it's the least attention grabbing, even though it's now dark and storming and raining heavily, and it's it would seem more ominous on the surface, but I don't think it's anywhere near as actually ominous in terms of dramatics or suspense as the first three covers. So I do think it's good, and of course it'll have the black spine and a wraparound art example, but I'm not really a fan of any of the Penguin covers. I think they're good, and I think this is probably one of the better ones because it is much more straightforward. But yeah, I don't really, I'm not really into it. Now to talk about the editions in my collection, which I have 3, which you see behind me. Now to first briefly mention, this is my only edition of this particular iteration of the series, but I have the 1972 British Collins printing. So this is what the Collins printed versions of the books look like from the late 60s into the 70s. They also have a sort of picture cover design, like the classic picture covers here in the US, but this is the point they updated to the really nice new artwork style. It does seem very much to me to be in sort of the same vein as what you would see on the Classic 3 Investigators series hardcovers, the original Harry Kane artwork, for example. So it seems to me that's kind of what they were going for. Once again, we have the same particular dramatic moment from the book highlighted, but here you actually get to see the boys being shot on the cover, which is, again, very striking for a children's book, but this is the only version that actually depicts the real moment of them being shot. So I thought that was really interesting. It's got wonderful color. It looks quite nice. These have wraparound spines, and they always have some sort of imagery representing from the book. So here is where the boys are searching in the cave for their lost pals. And you see the hand coming up from the actual cave floor, which is a nice touch. The back lists the titles, even though it is a little bit more generic looking. And these, at least this particular copy, it does have significant browning on the pages, but the actual, it's the revised text. The only difference otherwise is there's new custom front piece art, but there are none of the internal illustrations from the revised text. So these Collins and all the UK editions, they have their own sort of unique signifiers, but they also followed their own printing order in terms of the books. They weren't done in order, and then only certain volumes of the revised text were printed. The others were they were kept to their original text. So the British printing history, as I've discussed in some videos before, is kind of all over the place. It's a whole different iteration of the series, really, in terms of the actual stories and which ones were actually published in their revised editions, and the order's different, and they changed publishers and several times, and then the actual design of the books changed and the covers changed. So it's kind of all over the place. So if you get into collecting the series, if you start looking at the UK versions, you're going to drive yourself a bit crazy in terms of trying to learn all the variations. So next up is my original text copy. This is the lovely picture cover with the Rudy Nappy artwork. Again, his art first appeared in 1960 on the last hardcover edition with, of course, this as the dust jacket. So this is what it looked like when it transitioned over into the picture cover. However, this is one of those volumes where you can get a copy like this that still has the original text, but you get it in the much more common picture cover format. So this is one of the books where, depending on which version you're looking for, you actually have to check all the picture cover copies you see with the Nappy artwork, because there is at least a decent chance sometimes you might find an original text edition. So the particular version was in print for about 2, 3, maybe 4 years up until 1964 when the revision took over. So they will look pretty similar to this in terms of, they'll look pretty much exactly the same. So this is literally the final edition of the original text until the Applewood replica in the 1990s. So this is very much like your standard picture cover from the original point the picture covers took over. And as you can see, it lists to Aztec Warrior, which would date this as being a 1964 edition. So this is basically the last printing edition, or the last sort of gasp or last era for the original text, because literally in this same year the revised text would take over and would look identical to this, except of course it would be a little bit slimmer than the original edition. But because the picture cover is already a bit slimmer than the original tweed hardcover with dust jacket, you don't really notice the difference. So it kind of makes their cost-cutting measures of cutting down the pages a little bit nonsensical, because they already could get a whole original text copy in a nice, concise picture cover edition. The other giveaway, and this is a nice, easy way to glance at a copy and sort of at least know you're on the right track if you're looking for an original text edition, is it has the original brown and white end-scene end papers. Of course, shortly after this, they would transition over to the classic black and white multi-scene end papers. But this is always a good indication that you've got an earlier picture cover copy, and there's a good chance that it could indeed be the original text. Here we have the updated front piece art. I think this was originally done for the 40s edition. So they did this with a lot of the original textbooks when they would simplify the front art. The original edition, of course, would have a much fancier, almost sort of photo quality reproduction, and that's also in the Applewood edition. Of course, the real giveaway is the 1929 copyright date and the significantly longer page count of the chapter index, which of course also has significantly different chapter titles. And if that wasn't enough, the whole text block is different and is in the same style as all of the original text. This, of course, means that there are none of the the actual internal illustrations that you get in the revised text. So there's always a number of indicators if you've got a book like this in the picture cover format, and you're trying to figure out if it's a original text or revised text. And if you're just in a bookstore and you don't know the stuff off the top of your head, the indicators are always what end papers does it have, what's the copyright date, what's the page count, and you can very quickly glance at the actual text block and the actual font used. You can start to tell pretty quick once you see an original text example. But this is a particular printing. This is actually the very last printing of the original text in 1964. And then finally we have my childhood copy, which is the Flashlight Very Common edition. So this takes the picture cover artwork. It has the sort of, I always want to call it a sort of plasticky feeling cover in terms of the sort of finish and the way these are printed. This, of course, will be the most common version that you're going to find. And this particular printing is from 1998. And as I've talked about before, just like the picture cover, or really any edition of the books, you're going to notice printing variations in terms of some being better and some being worse if you look at a bunch of different copies. So if you go to a bookstore, you're probably going to find a lot of Flashlight editions in most, and a lot of times there'll be multiple copies of the same book. So if you ever are curious, or if you have multiple copies in your collection, you can put them side by side and notice some variations. This one is done really well. The color depth is really nicely done. I think the art really looks great here, especially for a Flashlight. In my experience, the earlier printings of the Flashlight editions from really at least the early 2000s, late 90s or so, are almost always much better than what you start getting around 2005 and later. By the mid 2000s, when they were still cranking out Flashlight editions, they started to get really sloppy and the artwork really suffered. Of course, with the Flashlights, you do have significant cropping on all sides, really, so that's always unfortunate. If you're a big fan of the art, it's always better to also have a picture cover edition, or especially a hardcover edition with the dust jacket if that artwork for the revised text is available in that form. But for a Flashlight edition, I think this one looks really great, and of course it is from 1998, so that's when they were really, I think, printing these a bit better. The design does not change in terms of the Flashlight editions. The rears and the spines are always the same, but this is just, I think, a really good example of one. And again, this is just literally my childhood copy. So we have the updated title page in terms of the actual the book list. And as all of these Flashlights show, the actual paper stock is a really bright white on this recycled paper stock. There we have the revised text front piece art. And of course the copyright page with the updated information there, the revised text chapters, and of course page 1. And of course we have the internal illustrations, which there are several scattered throughout the book, as all the revised texts do. So those are the editions in my collection and my general thoughts on the two different text editions of Book 7 in the series, The Secret of the Caves. Now, as I said throughout this video and the comparison section, I think this is really a direct parallel to the previous book, The Shore Road Mystery, in terms of the revised text adding an entire subplot and a lot of extra action, really amping up the action to a point where it is very much trying to seem much more modernized. And it seems like everyone felt the original text story was maybe a bit too simplistic. But due to the revision process, also cutting down the page count, the pacing is much faster, and the first thing to go in terms of the losses from the original text is the character development and the world building, and really getting into the grit and sort of day-to-day or daily life feeling of the actual characters in this in this particular mystery. And of course, you can't really compete with the prose of Leslie McFarlane, who is the series creator and who really defines the series. So it's kind of it's not an easy task, and it's not a fair comparison to make. But the revised text does once again have so much more additional content that it does actually stand on its own as a separate work, which is kind of what the Straight Meyer Syndicate was intending. And in that sense, I think Shore Road Mystery is the perfect comparison, because the revised text there, as I said, is one of the best examples of the revision process, and it still does retain the core plot of the original novel throughout. But here, I just think because the actual mystery itself is a bit more simplistic, because the core of original text mystery is in the revised text, and the boys go out to the Honeycomb Caves area, and they're sort of on their own, and it's a bit more of a quiet, sedate location, even though it is obviously it's a bit ominous in terms of the locale, because of that move to that particular location, and the boys are kind of just there for the majority of the story. Things don't quite move as quickly as they do in, say, for example, Shore Road Mystery again. So I think that does sort of alter the pace even of the revised text. So basically, I don't know if I would say if the revised text of Book 7 quite has the full impact of the revised text of Book 6, which immediately came before it. But it's still a great example of the revision process. It's still one of the best of the revised texts, and it does thankfully maintain the spirit and the main plot of the original, even though it goes, in a completely different direction after a certain point. You can recognize again the bones of the original story in terms of the plot are still there in the revised text, which is exactly what you should do if you're going to publish the same book under the same title, but not tell anybody that you've completely rewritten it and made the original plot secondary at some point to this new plot you've come up with. So even though the original plot is still here in the revised text, they are two distinct separate books, and again, they've sort of folded the original text plot into this revision text. So again, I think both are great. You can't really choose one over the other. It's just going to be personal preference, as is the case for most of these. The only times I can usually safely say that one is maybe perhaps better than the other is when just the difference overshadows the other book, as I felt in Missing Chums, for example, where the original text is so much more vivid and in your face and action-oriented and much darker than the revised text, which is still a classic of the revised text. That was just one particular case where you're reading the two texts and it just jumps out at you the whole time like a flashing neon sign that this is so much more vivid and different than the revised text you're used to. I know for a fact because it's coming up and we haven't gotten there yet, but once you get past the point where Leslie McFarlane didn't write all of the books, there is a point where there's sort of like an interruption, and there are some particular volumes, which I'll be getting to rather soon in this series, where the original texts, not written by McFarlane, are they're very odd. Let's just put it that way. And fans, of course, will know I'm referring to the John Button books, the most infamous being the original text of Book 19, The Disappearing Floor. But he also wrote The Secret Warning and The Twisted Claw, and they get a bit out there. Let's put it that way. So there are examples where the revised texts are much better, but that is usually not dealing with the Leslie McFarlane written books. But anyway, these are my thoughts on Book 7, The Secret of the Caves, and please stay tuned for the next in my series when I will return with definitely the most holiday-themed of the entire canon, which of course is Book 8, The Mystery of Cabin Island, which is my personal... Well, it is my favorite of the series because it was the first I ever read. It's what got me into the series and is the book that I think is probably the most responsible for me becoming such an avid reader because it hooked me so deeply. And it's a book that myself and pretty much I think all fans like to read around Christmas time because it is set during the holiday season. It has the wonderful wintry setting. And it is the definitive holiday book of the series, even though it's not, purporting to be a Christmas tale. It is set during the Christmas holiday season, and it is the sort of ultimate winter holiday book in the series. There are other great books to read during the holiday season and winter and snowy times, like Yellow Feather Mystery, for example. But Cabin Island is really the one that everybody thinks of, and it's the most special to me because it was the first I ever read. So I will be doing that, of course, for December. So as always, I hope this has been at least somewhat fun and informative to hear me talk once again about my lifelong obsession and ever continuing collecting of the Hardy Boys series. And please stay tuned for me to reappear and discuss Book 8, The Mystery of Cabin Island. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.